Money makes men patient. Power makes them careless. On the night Luca Rinaldi meant to promise forever to one woman, his trembling hands gave it to another. The ballroom held its breath. 400 of the city's most dangerous people watched a diamond slide onto the wrong finger. And the woman wearing it did something nobody in that family had ever dared to do. She smiled, and she took control. Eleanor Voss had learned a long time ago that the safest place in any room was the corner nobody was looking at. She had spent 3 years perfecting the art of being useful and invisible in the same breath, moving through the marble corridors of the Rinaldi estate with a leather folio pressed to her chest and her low heels making no sound at all on the polished stone. She kept the calendar. She kept the secrets. She kept, more than anything, her own head down. It was 7 in the morning on the day of the gala, and the estate was already a hive of controlled chaos. Florists were arguing with the head of security about where the delivery vans could park. A string quartet was rehearsing in the East Wing, the same 4 bars of a waltz looping over and over until the notes blurred together. Somewhere upstairs, a tailor was letting out the seam of a jacket that had fit perfectly 2 weeks ago and now, apparently, did not. Eleanor stood in the study with her tablet in hand, scrolling through a schedule that had been revised 4 times since midnight. Vendor confirmations, guest list cross-checked against the security detail. A reminder, flagged in red, that she had set herself 3 days earlier. Collect the ring from the vault at 4 p.m. Do not let Mr. Rinaldi carry it himself. He will lose it. Or worse, he will open the box in front of someone. She allowed herself a small, private smile at that note. It was, she thought, the truest thing she had ever written about her employer. Luca Rinaldi ran a shipping empire that everyone in the city understood, without ever quite saying it aloud, moved more than cargo. He had inherited the business from his father 8 years ago, at 29, and had spent every year since proving to men twice his age that inheritance and competence were not mutually exclusive. He was precise in his business and famously imprecise in his personal life. The kind of man who could recite a shipping manifest from memory, but could not remember, most mornings, where he had left his own phone. Eleanor had been hired to fix exactly that kind of gap. She managed his calendar, his correspondence, his household staff, and on more than one exhausted evening, his temper. She was good at her job. She was, if she allowed herself to admit it in the privacy of her own mind, better at managing Luca Rinaldi's life than anyone else had ever been, including, some days, Luca Rinaldi. Eleanor? His voice carried down the hallway before he did, a low, clipped baritone that always sounded like it was already halfway through an argument. He rounded the corner in a half-buttoned shirt, his dark hair still damp, a small velvet box in one hand like it might detonate. Tell me this is going to work. It's going to work, Eleanor said, without looking up from her tablet. The florists are handling the centerpieces now. The quartet knows the cue. Your uncle's toast has been trimmed down to 4 minutes, which he will ignore, but at least we tried. Not the party. Luca held up the box, his knuckles pale around the velvet. This. Eleanor did look up then. She had seen the ring exactly once before, 3 days ago, when Luca had summoned her to the vault at 11 at night, sworn her to secrecy with an intensity usually reserved for federal investigations, and shown her a ring so large and so precisely cut that she had genuinely worried for a moment that it was a prop. Isabella will say yes, Eleanor said simply. She has been telling her mother she'll say yes for 6 months. Everyone in this house knows it, except, apparently, you. Something in Luca's shoulders eased just slightly. He was not a man built for uncertainty, and tonight, for the first time in longer than Eleanor could remember, he looked entirely uncertain. Put it back in the vault, Eleanor said, gesturing at the box with 2 fingers, the way she might direct a delivery driver toward a loading dock. "I'll bring it to you at 8, right before the toast. If you carry it around all day, you'll either lose it or you'll take it out of the box to look at it 14 times and scratch the setting." Luca almost smiled. It was a rare expression on him, and it always seemed to surprise his own face when it arrived. "You know me too well." "It's my job to know you too well," Eleanor said, and turned back to her tablet, because if she looked at him for one more second, she was afraid he would see something on her face that she had worked very hard for 3 years to make sure nobody ever saw. She had not meant to fall in love with her employer. It was, she often thought, the single most inconvenient thing that had ever happened to her. More inconvenient than the eviction notice that had brought her to this city in the first place. More inconvenient than the 2 jobs she had worked simultaneously to put herself through business school before a recruiter with cold eyes and a generous salary offer had plucked her out of an unremarkable accounting firm and placed her, without much explanation, in the household of one of the most feared men in the region. She remembered her first week vividly. She had been terrified, certain she had made some catastrophic error in judgment, that she was one wrong word away from disappearing into a story other people whispered about at parties. But the terror had faded within a month, replaced by something far more dangerous: familiarity. Luca Rinaldi, up close, in the mundane hours of a Tuesday afternoon, was not the myth the city had built around him. He was a man who forgot to eat lunch when he was buried in contracts. He was a man who kept a photograph of his late mother in his desk drawer instead of on the wall, because, he told Eleanor once, in a rare unguarded moment, he didn't like sharing her with visitors. He was a man who trusted almost no one, and who had, gradually, without either of them quite noticing when it happened, come to trust Eleanor with nearly everything. Nearly everything except the one thing that mattered. Because Luca Rinaldi was engaged, in every sense but the formal one, to Isabella Conti, the daughter of an old and respected family from the old country, a woman as polished and deliberate as a chess opening. Their families had been circling each other for 2 generations. The union made sense on paper, in ballrooms, in every ledger that mattered to men like Luca's uncle, Don Salvatore, who had made no secret of his opinion that it was long past time for his nephew to secure the family's future with a marriage worthy of the Rinaldi name. Eleanor had met Isabella exactly 6 times, always briefly, always professionally. Isabella was, by any honest measure, beautiful and gracious, the kind of woman who remembered the names of household staff and asked after their families with what seemed like genuine warmth. Eleanor had no particular reason to dislike her. She disliked, instead, the quiet, persistent ache that lived somewhere beneath her sternum every time she watched Luca prepare to give his heart to someone else. She had never said a word about it. She never would. She had built her entire adult life on the principle that you did not confuse what you wanted with what you were owed, and she was not about to abandon that principle now, over a man who paid her salary and occasionally forgot where he'd left his reading glasses. By 6 that evening, the Rinaldi estate had transformed. The ballroom, usually reserved for quiet business dinners and the occasional tense family gathering, had been opened fully for the first time in years, its floor-to-ceiling windows draped in pale gold silk, its chandeliers lowered and polished until they threw small, trembling stars across the marble floor. Round tables dressed in white linen ringed a cleared dance floor. A raised platform had been built near the string quartet's corner, where, at 9 o'clock precisely, Luca Rinaldi intended to stand in front of 400 guests and ask Isabella Conti to marry him. Eleanor moved through the preparations like a conductor who never once picked up a baton. She corrected a caterer's seating chart. She intercepted a photographer who had wandered too close to a side room where Don Salvatore was meeting privately with 2 men Eleanor had never seen before and did not ask about. She checked, for the 9th time that day, that the small black velvet box was secure in the estate's private vault, untouched since that morning. At 7:30, she found Luca in his study, standing at the window with his hands in his pockets, staring out at the gardens as though they might offer him some kind of answer he hadn't thought to ask for. "You look like a man about to walk into a courtroom," Eleanor said from the doorway. "I feel like a man about to walk into a courtroom." He didn't turn around. "My uncle has already told me 3 times tonight that this marriage will, and I'm quoting him directly, secure this family for the next 50 years. He said it like he was reading off a shipping contract." "Is that not what you want?" Luca turned then. In the low evening light, his face looked older than his 37 years, weighted with something Eleanor couldn't quite name. "I want," he said slowly, "for one night in my life to not feel like a transaction." Eleanor didn't have an answer for that. She wasn't sure there was one, so she did what she always did when she didn't know what to say to Luca Rinaldi. She became useful. "The quartet has your cue," she said. "At 9, they'll shift from the waltz into the piece you chose. That's your signal to move to the platform. Isabella will be seated at the head table with her parents. Your uncle will be beside her. I'll have the ring ready backstage, in the small room behind the platform, at 8:45. You'll come get it from me directly. Nobody else touches it. Understood?" "Understood." He managed a small, tired smile. "What would I do without you, Eleanor?" "Fall behind on your correspondence and lose your reading glasses," she said, and left before her own voice could betray anything more than professional efficiency. By 8 o'clock, the ballroom was full. Eleanor stood near the edge of the room in a simple dark green dress she had chosen precisely because it would not draw attention, watching the city's wealthiest and most dangerous families circulate beneath the chandeliers with champagne flutes and carefully guarded conversation. She recognized faces from newspapers she had read long before she'd ever set foot in this house. A councilman here, a shipping magnate there, a scattering of men whose names she had learned to never say aloud in front of strangers. Isabella Conti arrived at 8:15 in a column of ivory silk, her dark hair swept back, a string of pearls at her throat that had, Eleanor happened to know, belonged to her grandmother. She moved through the room with the easy confidence of someone who had never once doubted her place in it. She found Luca near the bar, and Eleanor watched from across the room as Isabella laughed at something he said, her hand resting lightly on his forearm, entirely at home. Eleanor looked away first. She always did. At 8:40, she slipped out of the ballroom through a side corridor toward the small anteroom behind the raised platform, where the vault key sat waiting in the estate's private safe. The room was quiet, insulated from the noise of the party by 2 thick doors, lit by a single wall sconce. Eleanor opened the safe with the code Luca had given her, his mother's birthday, a fact she had never told him she found unbearably sweet, and lifted out the small black velvet box. She opened it, just to check, the way she always checked everything twice. The ring sat nestled in white satin, an oval diamond flanked by 2 smaller stones, catching the low light and throwing it back in sharp, cold fragments. It was, she thought, a genuinely beautiful ring. It belonged on Isabella Conti's hand. It would look extraordinary there, in front of everyone, at 9 o'clock. She closed the box and waited. At 8:44, the door burst open, and it was not Luca who came through it. It was Marco Bellini, the head of the estate's security detail, a broad-shouldered man Eleanor had worked alongside for 3 years, his face tight with the particular urgency that, in this house, usually meant something had gone very wrong, very quickly. "Eleanor, thank God!" Marco's eyes went straight to the velvet box in her hand. "We have a problem. There's a car parked 2 blocks out that wasn't cleared through the guest list, and Mr. Rinaldi wants eyes on it before he goes anywhere near that platform. He's on the North Terrace with Salvatore right now, and he needs the ring brought to him there instead. He can't leave the terrace until we clear the situation." Eleanor's stomach dropped, but her training took over instantly. "Is it a threat?" "Probably nothing. Probably some idiot who parked in the wrong spot. but you know how he gets." Marco was already backing toward the door. "He said to bring the box to him directly. He doesn't want it sitting unattended in here while we sort this out." "Go," Eleanor said. "I'll bring it." She moved quickly, the box clutched tight in one hand, weaving through a service corridor that ran along the back of the ballroom toward the terrace doors. Her heart was pounding, not with fear exactly, but with the particular adrenaline of a plan disrupted, of 100 small details suddenly needing to be resequenced in real time. She reached the terrace to find Luca standing near the balustrade with his uncle, both men's faces drawn tight, their voices low and urgent in a language Eleanor understood only in fragments. "It's fine," Luca was saying, though his jaw was set in a way that suggested he didn't fully believe it. "Marco's handling it. It's probably nothing." "It is never nothing," Don Salvatore said, his voice a gravel rasp beneath a thick accent that decades in the city had never quite worn away. "You are about to make the most important announcement of your life in front of 400 witnesses, and there is an unmarked car sitting 2 blocks from this house. You will forgive me if I do not find that reassuring." Eleanor stepped forward, the box held out. "Mr. Rinaldi, the ring." Luca turned to her, and for a fraction of a second, something in his face cracked open. Relief, maybe, or gratitude, or simply the exhausted recognition of a familiar face in a moment of chaos. "Eleanor, good. Give it here." What happened next happened very fast, and afterward, when Eleanor tried to reconstruct it in her mind, she could never quite separate the pieces into a clean sequence. Marco reappeared at the terrace doors, breathless, calling Luca's name with an urgency that pulled every head in the vicinity toward him. Don Salvatore's phone rang, sharp and sudden, and he stepped away to answer it, his voice dropping instantly into the low, clipped tones he used for business. And somewhere below, in the garden, a car door slammed loud enough to carry up through the terrace stones. Luca's attention split 3 ways at once. He reached for the box in Eleanor's hand at the exact moment she was turning to see what Marco wanted, and in the tangle of motion, his hand closing over the box, hers still partly extended, both of them half turned toward the noise below, the box slipped, tipped, and the ring nearly fell entirely. Luca caught it, barely. His hand shot out on instinct and closed around the diamond band before it could hit the stone floor, and in the same motion, still not fully looking at what he was doing, still half listening to Marco's report about the car, he reached for the nearest hand to steady himself and, without thought, without intention, slid the ring onto the finger closest to his own. It was Eleanor's finger. The world seemed to pause for exactly 1 full second. Eleanor looked down at her own hand, at the ring now sitting snug against her knuckle, and felt something like the floor tilting beneath her, though she hadn't moved at all. "Luca," she started. And that was the moment the terrace doors opened fully, and Isabella Conti stepped through them, drawn by the commotion, followed by a small cluster of curious guests who had noticed the flurry of activity and trailed after her the way people always trail after the possibility of a scene. Isabella's eyes went immediately to Luca, then, following the line of his gaze, to his hand still wrapped around Eleanor's, to the unmistakable glint of a diamond on Eleanor's finger, catching the terrace lights exactly the way it had been designed to. The silence that followed was the loudest thing Eleanor had ever heard. "Luca," Isabella said, very quietly, very carefully, the way a person speaks when they are trying not to believe what they are seeing. "What is this?" Luca looked down at his own hand as though it belonged to someone else. He looked at Eleanor's finger. He looked, finally, genuinely, understanding crashing into his face all at once, at the small black velvet box now empty in his other hand. "It's not," he started. "Isabella, this is not what it—" But it was too late. Somewhere behind Isabella, near the terrace doors, a woman's voice, Eleanor never learned whose, said, with the particular delighted horror of someone about to become the center of the evening's real gossip. "Oh my God, he proposed to the secretary." The word moved through the small crowd like a spark through dry grass. Secretary, ring, proposed. Within seconds, more guests were drifting toward the terrace, drawn by the electric certainty that something extraordinary had just happened, and every single one of them was looking at Eleanor's hand. Isabella's face had gone very pale, very still, in the way of someone holding themselves together through sheer force of will. 400 people, she said, her voice shaking now beneath its careful control, are inside that ballroom right now, waiting for you to propose to me, and you put the ring on her. It was an accident, Luca said, and even to Eleanor's ears, the words sounded thin and useless against the size of what had just happened. The box slipped. I caught the ring. I wasn't even... Isabella, please, let me explain. Explain what exactly? Isabella's eyes finally moved to Eleanor, and there was nothing cruel in them, which somehow made it worse, only a kind of devastated, dawning understanding, as though pieces she had never quite let herself examine were suddenly arranging themselves into a picture she couldn't unsee. How long has this been happening? Nothing has been happening, Eleanor said quickly, her voice steadier than she felt. Ms. Conti, I promise you, this was an accident. Marco came to the terrace. There was a security concern. The box tipped. Mr. Rinaldi caught the ring on instinct. Take it off, Isabella said. Eleanor was already reaching for it. Her fingers found the band and pulled, and for one horrible, absurd second, it didn't move. The ring had settled snug against her knuckle, and in her rush, her hand had gone slightly damp with panic, and the diamond simply would not slide free. More guests were arriving at the terrace doors now, phones lifting on instinct before their owners could think better of it, the murmur of the crowd swelling into something Eleanor could feel pressing against her skin like heat off a stove. It's stuck, she said, mortified, working the ring with her other hand. Give me 1 second, it's just... Of course it's stuck, Isabella said, and there was real pain in her voice now, cutting through the composure. Of course it fits. Isabella. Luca stepped toward her, reaching for her hand. She pulled it back before he could take it. Don't, she said. Don't you dare stand there and tell me this doesn't mean anything, Luca, when you can't even look at her without... She stopped herself, pressed her lips together, and Eleanor watched a woman who had spent her entire life being taught never to make a scene, fight, visibly, physically, against the urge to make one now. The ring finally gave, sliding free of Eleanor's knuckle all at once. She held it out immediately, her hand trembling slightly, toward Isabella. Please, she said, it belongs to you. It was always meant for you. But Isabella didn't reach for it. She looked at the ring in Eleanor's outstretched palm the way a person looks at something they have already decided has been ruined beyond salvaging. I don't want it like this, she said quietly. I don't want anything like this. She turned, and the crowd that had gathered at the terrace doors parted for her instinctively, the way crowds always part for the person everyone secretly agrees has been wronged. She walked back into the ballroom, her spine straight, her chin level, and disappeared into the golden light and the low murmur of 400 people who did not yet know what had happened, but were already beginning to sense that something had. For a long moment, nobody on the terrace moved. Luca stood frozen, staring after her, his hand still half extended in the empty air where he'd tried to reach for her. Don Salvatore had finished his phone call and was watching the entire scene with an expression Eleanor couldn't read, somewhere between fury and calculation. Marco hovered near the doors, clearly torn between his original mission, the unidentified car, now entirely forgotten, and the much larger crisis currently unfolding in front of him. Eleanor stood very still, the ring in her open palm, feeling the weight of dozens of unfamiliar eyes settling on her. She could feel her heartbeat in her throat. She had spent 3 years mastering the art of being unnoticed in this house, and in the space of 90 seconds, she had become the single most visible person in it. "Everyone back inside," Don Salvatore said suddenly, his voice cutting through the murmuring crowd with the flat authority of a man used to being obeyed instantly. "There is nothing to see. Go and enjoy the party." The crowd dispersed slowly, reluctantly, phones still lifted, whispers still trailing behind them like smoke. Eleanor caught fragments as they went. "Did you see her hand? I heard she's been his secretary for years. Is she even from a family anyone knows?" And forced herself to keep her expression perfectly, professionally neutral, the way she had trained herself to do through 3 years of overhearing things she was never meant to hear. When the terrace was finally empty, except for the 4 of them, Luca turned to her, his face a mess of horror and apology. "Eleanor, I am so sorry. I wasn't even looking. I just reacted. I didn't mean—" "I know," Eleanor said quietly. "It's all right, Luca. It was an accident. Everyone will understand it was an accident." "Will they?" Don Salvatore's voice was cold, precise, because from where I stood, it looked to 400 guests, most of whom matter a great deal to this family's business, like my nephew proposed to his secretary in front of his fiancée. "It wasn't a proposal," Eleanor said, more sharply than she intended. "It was a ring that slipped and a hand that happened to be there. Nothing more." Don Salvatore studied her for a long moment, and Eleanor had the distinct, uncomfortable sensation of being weighed and measured by a man who did that kind of arithmetic for a living. "Perhaps," he said finally, "but perception, Miss Voss, is its own kind of truth in rooms like that one. And right now, the perception is a disaster." Luca ran a hand through his hair, his composure, the careful, controlled bearing he wore like a second suit in every business meeting Eleanor had ever watched him conduct, entirely gone. "I need to go after her," he said. "I need to explain." "You need to go back into that ballroom," his uncle corrected, "and give some kind of speech that does not involve the word engagement before 400 people finish deciding for themselves what just happened. Then you can go after her." Luca looked, for just a moment, like a man being asked to choose between 2 impossible things. Then his eyes found Eleanor's, and something in his expression softened, steadied, as though her presence alone were enough to anchor him. "What do I say?" he asked her. It was, Eleanor realized with a small, painful lurch in her chest, the same question he had been asking her, in one form or another, for 3 years. "What do I say? What do I do? Handle this." She had always known the answer. "You go back in," Eleanor said, forcing her voice into the calm, clipped efficiency that had gotten her through every other crisis in this house. "And you tell them there was a small accident backstage, that the evening's real announcement will happen when it happens, and that everyone should keep drinking excellent champagne at your family's expense. You do not mention names. You do not explain. You smile, you thank them for coming, and you buy yourself time. That's all a speech needs to do tonight." Luca stared at her for a long moment. "You always know what to say." "It's my job," Eleanor said, and this time the words felt like they cost her something to say. He went. Eleanor watched him disappear back through the terrace doors, straightening his jacket as he walked, visibly reassembling the composed, commanding man the city knew, and felt her own carefully constructed calm begin, finally, to crack. Don Salvatore remained on the terrace with her, his sharp eyes never leaving her face. "You handled that well," he said after a moment. It did not sound entirely like a compliment. "I didn't handle anything," Eleanor said. "I told him what to say. That's all I've ever done in this house." "Is it?" Salvatore's voice was quiet, almost gentle, which somehow made it more unsettling than his earlier coldness. Miss Voss, I have watched my nephew for 8 years. I have watched him negotiate with men who would happily see this entire family destroyed, and I have never once seen him look as unsteady as he looked 2 minutes ago, standing on this terrace, with a ring on the wrong hand. He paused. I wonder, sometimes, whether the mistake was really an accident at all, or whether a man's hands simply know things his mind has not yet permitted him to say out loud. Eleanor felt her face heat, and hated herself for it. With respect, Don Salvatore, that's not something I'm in a position to comment on. No, he agreed, but you understand my meaning. She did. She wished, fiercely, that she didn't. Inside the ballroom, Luca delivered the vaguest, most controlled speech of his life. Eleanor watched from the terrace doors as he thanked the guests for their generosity, made a joke about backstage chaos that landed with exactly the polite, uncertain laughter he'd been hoping for, and announced that dinner would begin shortly. He did not mention Isabella. He did not mention the ring. By the time he stepped down from the small platform, the ballroom had returned to its low, glittering hum, though Eleanor could see, scattered among the tables, small clusters of guests leaning in close, whispering behind raised hands. She did not see Isabella again that night. She had, according to Marco, left the estate entirely within 20 minutes of the incident, her parents trailing after her with expressions of grim, humiliated fury. Eleanor spent the rest of the gala exactly where she had spent every event before it. In the margins, managing, correcting, smoothing. Except that now, every time she crossed the ballroom floor, she felt the weight of curious eyes following her, and heard, more than once, her own name mentioned in a hushed voice she wasn't meant to catch. It was nearly 1 a.m. by the time the last guests departed and the estate finally fell quiet. Eleanor was in the study, gathering the final reports from the caterers, exhausted down to her bones, when Luca appeared in the doorway. He had taken off his jacket. His tie hung loose around his open collar. He looked, for the first time all night, entirely like himself, tired, human, uncertain, instead of the composed man the ballroom had demanded he perform. You should be in bed, Eleanor said, without looking up from the papers in her hands. I could say the same to you. I have 3 vendor invoices that need approving before tomorrow morning, and a very unhappy florist who is threatening to bill us for centerpieces that got knocked over during the chaos on the terrace. Eleanor set the papers down finally and looked at him. How is she? Luca's jaw tightened. I called. She won't speak to me. Her mother told me in no uncertain terms that the engagement is off, and that the Conti family will be re-evaluating its relationship with this house going forward. Luca, I'm so sorry. Don't be. He crossed the room slowly and sat, heavily, in the chair across from her desk, the same chair where he had reviewed 1,000 contracts, negotiated 100 deals, and never once, as far as Eleanor knew, looked as lost as he looked now. I've been trying to figure out, all night, what I actually feel about any of it. And the truth is, Eleanor, I keep coming back to the same thing, and it isn't grief over Isabella. Eleanor's heart was beating very fast. What is it then? Luca looked at her for a long moment, and in the low lamplight of the study, something in his face was open in a way she had never seen before, not once in 3 years. I keep thinking about the way that ring looked on your hand, he said quietly, and how, for about 10 seconds before everything fell apart, it looked exactly right, like it belonged there. Luca. Eleanor's voice came out barely above a whisper. I know, he said quickly, before she could finish, holding up one hand. I know this is not the moment. I know I just humiliated a woman I've known for years, in front of 400 people, and that whatever I feel right now might just be shock or guilt, or my own mind grasping for the nearest safe thing to hold on to. I know all of that. I'm not asking you for anything tonight, Eleanor. I needed to say it out loud, once, to someone who wasn't going to use it against me. Eleanor sat very still, her hands folded tightly in her lap to keep them from shaking. 3 years of careful, disciplined silence sat behind her teeth, and she had never once, not in the darkest, most exhausted hours of this job, imagined she would have to decide, on the spot, whether to finally let any of it out. I think, she said slowly, choosing every word with the same precision she brought to every calendar entry, every contract, every carefully worded email sent on his behalf, that you should sleep. And in the morning, when you're not exhausted and humiliated and running on champagne and adrenaline, if you still feel the same way, then we can talk about it properly. But not tonight, Luca. Not like this. He studied her for a long moment, and something that might have been disappointment, or might have been respect, moved across his face. That's very sensible, he said finally. It's my job to be sensible, Eleanor said, and this time, when the words left her mouth, they didn't feel quite as much like a wall between them as they usually did. The next morning, the city's gossip columns had already found the story. Eleanor scrolled through 3 separate headlines before 9 a.m. Shipping Heir's society wedding derailed by ring mix-up. Rinaldi fiancé walks out after ballroom scandal. Who is the mystery woman wearing Luca Rinaldi's ring? Each one accompanied by a blurry photograph taken by some guest's phone, showing Eleanor's hand extended toward Isabella, the diamond catching the terrace light exactly as badly as she remembered. She read every article standing in the estate's kitchen with a cup of coffee going cold in her hand, and by the third one, she had made a decision. She found Luca in his study an hour later, already deep in a call with his lawyer, his voice low and urgent as he tried to manage the fallout with the Conti family's representatives. She waited until he ended the call before she spoke. I think I should resign, she said. Luca looked up sharply. What? The story is everywhere, Luca. Every photograph, every headline has my name attached to it now. I've become a liability to this family's reputation, and I think the cleanest way to make this go away is for me to step back from the role. You can find another private secretary within the week. It will let the story die faster than anything else we could do. No. The word came out of him fast, almost harsh, and he seemed surprised by his own vehemence. He stood, came around the desk, and stopped a few feet from her, his hands loosely fisted at his sides, as though he were physically restraining himself from something. Eleanor, no, I'm not. I refuse to let you disappear from this house because of my mistake. You didn't do anything wrong. I put that ring on your hand. If anyone should be paying the price for last night, it should be me, not you. Luca, this isn't about fairness. This is about damage control. Your uncle already thinks. I don't care what my uncle thinks. Luca's voice had gone quiet, but there was something steely underneath it, a certainty Eleanor had rarely heard from him outside of a business negotiation. I have spent 8 years letting this family's reputation dictate every decision I make, who I hire, who I marry, what I say in a room full of people I don't even like. And last night, for 10 accidental seconds, something happened that wasn't dictated by any of that, and it was the first time in longer than I can remember that something in my life felt honest. Eleanor's chest ached with the effort of keeping her composure. You can't build a decision on 10 accidental seconds. No, Luca agreed, but I can build one on 3 years of watching you run this house better than I run my own company. I can build one on the fact that when everything fell apart on that terrace last night, the only person whose judgment I trusted enough to ask, "What do I say now?" was you. That wasn't an accident, Eleanor. That's been true for a long time. I just never let myself look at it directly. Eleanor didn't trust herself to answer immediately. She stood very still, feeling the careful architecture of 3 years of professional distance beginning to shift beneath her, and forced herself to breathe slowly before she spoke. "You need time," she said finally. "You need to sort out what happened with Isabella properly, whatever that looks like. An apology, a real conversation, whatever she's owed. And your family needs to see that this house isn't in chaos. I am not going to be the reason this family's business relationships collapse, Luca. That's not fair to you, and it's not fair to me." "So what are you saying?" "I'm saying give it time," Eleanor said. "Fix what needs fixing. Let the story quiet down. And if, after all of that, you still feel the way you say you feel, then we can have a very different conversation." Luca held her gaze for a long moment, and Eleanor watched him make a decision, visibly, the same way she'd watched him decide 1,000 times in board meetings whether to push a deal further or let it breathe. "All right," he said finally. "Time. But, Eleanor, you're not resigning. I need you here. Not just because you're good at your job, because I trust you, more than I trust nearly anyone else who walks through that front door. That's not going to change, however long we wait." It was, Eleanor thought, the closest thing to a promise she had ever heard him make. The weeks that followed were, by any professional measure, the strangest of Eleanor's career. The gossip columns eventually lost interest, the way gossip columns always do, replaced by newer scandals belonging to other families. The Conti family issued a brief, dignified statement about a mutual decision to part ways, carefully scrubbed of any details, and Isabella herself, Eleanor heard through the estate's grapevine, had left the city for an extended stay with relatives abroad, which struck Eleanor as both a kindness to herself and a small, quiet mercy that Eleanor was deeply grateful for, because she had never wanted, not for 1 second, to be the reason another woman's heart had been broken in front of a room full of strangers. Luca threw himself into work with a focus Eleanor hadn't seen from him in years, closing 2 long-stalled shipping contracts within a month, and personally overseeing a renegotiation with a difficult supplier that Eleanor had watched frustrate him for the better part of a year. He was, if anything, sharper than before, more decisive, as though the collapse of the engagement had cleared something out of him that had been cluttering his judgment for a long time. And through all of it, he and Eleanor settled into a rhythm that was both entirely familiar and subtly, unmistakably different. He still relied on her for everything: the calendar, the correspondence, the small daily decisions that kept his life running smoothly. But there was a new gentleness in the way he asked, a new attentiveness in the way he listened when she answered. He started remembering small things about her that had nothing to do with her job, that she took her coffee with too much sugar and always looked faintly guilty about it, that she hated the color of the drapes in the East Wing and had never once complained about it, that she had a habit of humming under her breath when she was concentrating on something difficult. "You're staring," Eleanor said one afternoon, 6 weeks after the gala, without looking up from the contract she was reviewing at his desk. "I'm not staring," Luca said. "I'm supervising." "You have never once supervised my work in 3 years. Then perhaps I've decided it's time to start." There was a warmth in his voice that made Eleanor's pulse trip over itself, even as she kept her eyes fixed determinedly on the page in front of her. It was Don Salvatore who forced the issue, in the end, in the direct, unadorned way he seemed to approach every decision that mattered. He summoned Eleanor to his private study on a gray Thursday afternoon in early autumn, a room she had entered perhaps a dozen times in 3 years, always briefly, always for some specific piece of business he needed handled. He was seated behind a heavy oak desk when she arrived, a glass of dark red wine untouched at his elbow, his sharp eyes fixed on her the moment she stepped through the door. "Sit, Miss Voss." Eleanor sat. "Is there something you need, Don Salvatore?" "I need to understand something," he said, "and I would prefer you tell me honestly, rather than give me the careful, diplomatic answer I suspect you've been rehearsing since the invitation reached your desk this morning." He leaned back slightly in his chair. My nephew has not looked at another woman since the night of that ballroom. He has turned down 2 very reasonable introductions I arranged myself, from families whose alliance would have been extremely valuable to this business. When I ask him why, he changes the subject with a skill I taught him myself, which tells me he has learned it from me far too well to use it against me. So I will ask you directly, what is happening between the 2 of you? Eleanor met his eyes steadily, even though her heart was pounding. With respect, Don Salvatore, I think that's a question for your nephew. I am asking you. She considered lying. She considered, for one brief moment, the careful, professional deflection that had served her well for 3 years. A vague answer, a change of subject, the same skill Salvatore had just accused his nephew of learning from him. But she was tired, she realized, tired of the careful architecture she'd built around her own feelings, tired of pretending that a ring sliding onto her finger by accident hadn't cracked something open in her that she had spent 3 years trying very hard to keep shut. I care about him, she said finally. I have cared about him for longer than I should admit to his uncle. I never intended for it to happen, and I never once acted on it. Not for a single day of the 3 years I've worked in this house. What happened at the gala was an accident, Don Salvatore. I want you to understand that clearly. But I would be lying to you if I said that accident didn't reveal something that had already been true for a long time. Don Salvatore was quiet for a long moment, studying her with an intensity that made Eleanor want, badly, to look away. She didn't. You understand what this family is, he said finally. You have worked in this house long enough to understand what it means to be tied to the Rinaldi name. It is not a small thing, Miss Voss. It comes with weight, with danger on occasion, however carefully we try to shield the people we love from it, with scrutiny that will follow you for the rest of your life. I understand, Eleanor said. I've watched it up close for 3 years. I'm not under any illusions about what it costs. And yet you're still sitting in this chair, telling me you care for my nephew, instead of telling me it was a mistake best forgotten. Yes, Eleanor said simply. Something shifted in Don Salvatore's expression. Not quite a smile, but something adjacent to one, a loosening around his eyes that Eleanor had never seen there before. You know, he said, the night of the gala, I told Luca that perception is its own kind of truth. I still believe that. But I have also learned over 61 years that some accidents are not truly accidents at all. They are simply the moment a truth a person has been carrying finally finds a crack to slip through. He picked up his wine glass at last, turning it slowly by the stem. I do not give my blessing easily, Miss Voss. I did not give it easily for Isabella Conti, and her family had been allied with ours for 2 generations. But I have watched you manage this house for 3 years with more competence and more loyalty than half the men on my payroll, and I find, somewhat to my own surprise, that I do not object to the direction this appears to be heading. Eleanor let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Thank you, Don Salvatore. Don't thank me yet, he said, echoing, without knowing it, the exact words Eleanor had heard from another Rinaldi voice months earlier, in a different room, under very different circumstances. Thank me when my nephew finally works up the courage to say to your face what he has apparently been too afraid to say for 6 weeks. It happened on a Sunday evening in late October, in the same study where Luca had confessed, on the night of the gala, that a ring on the wrong hand had looked exactly right. The estate was quiet, most of the staff gone for the evening, the gardens outside the tall windows turning gold and rust with the season. Eleanor had stayed late finishing a report on the shipping contracts Luca had spent the autumn renegotiating, and she was surprised, when she finally looked up from her laptop, to find him standing in the doorway, watching her with an expression she couldn't quite place. "You're still here," she said. "So are you." "I had reports to finish." "Did you?" Luca crossed the room slowly, and Eleanor noticed, with a small jolt, that he was holding something behind his back. "Or were you waiting for me to finally stop being a coward about this?" Eleanor's pulse tripped. "Luca." "Let me finish." He stopped in front of her desk, and for a moment he looked almost exactly as he had on the terrace 6 weeks earlier, unsteady, uncertain, stripped of the composed authority he wore for everyone else in this house. "I have spent 6 weeks telling myself I was giving you time, giving myself time, being responsible, being careful, doing everything the right way instead of the fast way. And every single day of those 6 weeks, Eleanor, I have thought about that ring on your hand, and about the fact that for 10 seconds, before everything fell apart, it was the single most honest moment of my entire adult life." He brought his hand around from behind his back. It was not, Eleanor saw with a small, disbelieving jolt, the same ring. This one was simpler, a single clean stone on a slim band, nothing like the elaborate piece that had caused so much chaos in the summer. But the box was unmistakable, small and dark, held out toward her with a hand that, Eleanor noticed, was trembling slightly. "I'm not going to get down on one knee in a ballroom full of 400 strangers this time," Luca said. "I've learned my lesson about grand gestures in front of an audience. But I am asking you, Eleanor Voss, quietly, in a room where nobody is watching but the two of us. Will you marry me? Not because a ring slipped onto your hand by accident, because I have thought about nothing else for 6 weeks, and because I have never once, in 8 years of running this family's business, trusted anyone the way I trust you, and because I think, if I'm honest, some part of me has loved you for far longer than I let myself admit." Eleanor stared at the ring, and then at him, and felt something in her chest that had been held tight and careful for 3 years, finally, entirely, come undone. "I've spent 3 years telling myself I was imagining it," she said, her voice unsteady. "Telling myself it was inappropriate, unprofessional, unwise. I built an entire career on being careful, Luca, on never wanting anything I wasn't sure I was allowed to have. And now?" Eleanor stood, came around the desk, and looked up at him, close enough now to see every small, hopeful, terrified detail of his face. "Now," she said, "I think I'd like to stop being careful." She held out her hand, and this time, when Luca slid the ring onto her finger, there was no chaos, no crowd, no security emergency pulling his attention in 3 directions at once. There was only the quiet study, the gold evening light through the tall windows, and the two of them, entirely and deliberately certain, for the first time, of exactly where they wanted to be. News of the second engagement moved through the city far more slowly and far more gently than news of the first had. There was no gala this time, no 400 guests, no photographers lying in wait near the terrace doors. Luca had insisted on that much at least. A small, private dinner with family, held in the same ballroom that had once witnessed his greatest public humiliation, its chandeliers dimmed low, its long windows open to the autumn air. Don Salvatore rose at the end of the meal to give a toast, and, true to his nephew's earlier prediction, he ignored every instruction anyone had ever given him about keeping it brief. "I have spent 61 years, he said, raising his glass, his sharp eyes moving between Luca and Eleanor with something that looked, for once, entirely unguarded. "Watching men in this family make decisions for the sake of business, for the sake of legacy, for the sake of everything except their own hearts. My nephew made a mistake in this very room 6 months ago that cost him a great deal, and I will admit, I was furious with him for it. But I have come to believe, watching the two of them these past months, that it was not truly a mistake at all. It was the first honest thing Luca Rinaldi had done in years. He looked at Eleanor, and something like genuine warmth moved across his weathered face. To Eleanor, who kept this family running long before any of us had the good sense to notice how much we needed her. And to my nephew, who finally put the ring on the right hand. The small gathered crowd laughed, warm and easy, and Eleanor felt Luca's hand find hers under the table, his fingers threading through hers with the same steadiness he'd carried into every difficult negotiation she'd ever watched him win. Later, when the guests had gone and the ballroom had emptied back into its quiet, unlit stillness, Eleanor and Luca stood together near the same terrace where everything had first fallen apart, the city spread out below them in a wash of distant light. "Do you ever think about it?" Eleanor asked. "That night, how different everything could have gone if the box hadn't slipped." Luca was quiet for a moment, his eyes on the horizon. "I think about it all the time," he said finally. "I think about how close I came to spending my life with the wrong person, simply because it was the expected thing, the sensible thing, the thing that made sense on paper. And I think about how strange it is that the worst moment of my life turned out to be the moment that finally showed me what I actually wanted." He turned to look at her, and in the low light, his expression was unguarded in a way Eleanor had only ever seen a handful of times in 3 years. "I used to think control was the most important thing a man in my position could have. Control over the business, control over the family, control over every small detail of a room before anything could go wrong in it. And then a ring slipped, and everything went wrong, in front of everyone who mattered, and it turned out to be the best thing that ever happened to me." Eleanor smiled, leaning into him, the city lights blurring gently in her vision. "For what it's worth," she said, "I never once thought you were a man who liked losing control." "I'm not," Luca said. "But I've decided I don't mind it, as long as it's you I'm falling toward when I lose it." Below them, the gardens had gone quiet and dark with the season, and somewhere in the house behind them, the last of the staff was closing up for the night, turning off lights one room at a time, until the only light left burning was the one on the terrace where they stood. Eleanor thought, standing there, about the woman she had been 3 years earlier, exhausted, careful, invisible by design, certain that safety meant never wanting anything she wasn't sure she was allowed to have. She thought about the version of herself who had watched Luca Rinaldi prepare to marry someone else and had told herself firmly that her only job was to make it happen smoothly. She thought about how strange it was that the entire trajectory of her life had turned, in the end, on 10 accidental seconds and a ring that wouldn't quite come off her finger. She had spent so long believing that the safest place in any room was the corner nobody was looking at. It had taken a diamond on the wrong hand in front of 400 witnesses to finally teach her that some of the most important moments in a life are not the ones you plan carefully from the shadows. They are the ones that find you, however clumsily, however publicly, and refuse to let you disappear back into the corner ever again. Luca Rinaldi built an empire on precision, on control, on never letting a single detail slip past his notice. And in the end, it was the one thing that did slip. A ring, a hand, 10 accidental seconds on a crowded terrace that gave him the one thing his careful planning never could. What do you think? Was it fate? Or was it simply a man's hands finally telling the truth his mind hadn't caught up to yet? Let us know in the comments below. If this slow burn story of mistaken rings and quiet devotion pulled you in, hit that like button, share it with someone who loves a good mafia romance, and subscribe for more heartfelt stories every week. See you in the next one.